Here in stop number 2, we're going to talk about how matter can change through physical changes or chemical changes. And what's actually changing are the substance's properties. So before we get to the actual changes, we want to make sure that we understand what properties are and what the different kinds of properties are. So we're going to be on page 4, right behind the last set of notes about compounds. Our title is going to be Properties. Okay. And for when we think of a property, we can kind of think of that as a characteristic or a quality of something. Okay. Let me zoom in a little here for us. Okay, so I'm going to be here at the top of the page with our definition. All right. So we're going to say that properties are physical and chemical characteristics. Again, that's kind of another word for property. Physical and chemical characteristics of matter used to describe or identify a substance. So again, it says that properties are physical and chemical characteristics of matter used to describe or identify a substance. So there are 2 categories of properties, and they're mentioned here, physical and chemical. So for the remainder of the page, kind of towards the bottom, I'm going to create a T-chart. Okay. On one side, I'm going to talk about physical properties, and on the other side, we're going to talk about chemical properties. So here's my chart. I'm going to draw a line down the middle. Okay. On the left side, I'm going to talk about physical property. And on the right side, we'll talk about a chemical property. All right. A physical property is a characteristic that we can see or observe without actually changing the substance. We're able to just look at it or test it without causing any changes. Okay, so we're going to write that here. A characteristic that can be observed without changing the substance. Okay. We're also going to include some examples. All right. So an example of a physical property, something that we could see or observe or measure without actually changing the substance, would be color. We can look at something, any type of substance or object, determine the color without making any changes. We could also measure mass or volume. Those are 2 things we've already talked about this year. Again, we would not have to change anything if we were measuring the mass or the volume. The substance would stay the same. Okay. Another physical property would be melting point. At what point does something melt? Okay. If you think about ice, and if you melt that, it turns into water. That's technically not changing the substance. It's still H2O. That's what water is, whether it's a liquid or whether it's a solid. All right, so we're going to say melting point. Something you may be familiar with from 5th grade is conductivity. Is it able to conduct heat or electricity? Like, does it allow that energy to pass through? Okay, you can observe that without changing the substance. On the opposite side, a chemical property is a characteristic that we can only see or observe or measure if there is actually a change to the substance. The atoms in that matter, like those elements or compounds, are rearranging and changing in something that we call a chemical change, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit. So I'm going to say that it is a characteristic that can only be observed or measured when atoms of matter rearrange during a chemical change. So a characteristic that can only be observed or measured when atoms of matter rearrange during a chemical change. We'll talk more in the next few videos about the types of changes, and one of those is a chemical change. But just know that that's where the matter, the substance, is actually changing. So some examples. One example would be flammability. Flammability sounds like the word flame, so that's exactly what that means, is does it have the ability to catch fire or burn. Another example is reactivity. In the teacher station we talked about how some elements can combine to form compounds. We call reactivity how easily an element or a substance will combine with something else. Okay? And then also solubility. Does it have the ability to dissolve in a solution?